I like to think of automotive eras as always having a bit of good, a bit of bad, and a bit of ugly. For example, as beautiful as cars from the 50s may have been, there was the Crossley Hotshot. For as bad and ugly as cars from the 40s or the 2010s may have been, there was the Jaguar XK120 and, the ND Miata. Some eras, however, have had a little too much bad and a little too much ugly. The 1970s was that decade. In his fantastic and thorough book on the shift of the global dominance in the automotive industry through the 70s, David Halberstam points to a key moment halfway through 1973 that would mark a shift from what we could call the old order to the new. At this time, Detroit was still dominating, selling upwards of 10 million cars per year, all heavy and large and getting roughly 13 miles per gallon, and absolutely loaded with expensive features. And Detroit was absolutely rolling in money. But a storm was coming, not just in the form of the oil crisis, but also in the way that other countries would respond to it. Not just Germany or Great Britain or Italy, but more importantly, from the East. So what was that moment halfway through 73? Well, it was a meeting between the higher-ups in Detroit and a young brilliant man named Charlie Maxwell. Charlie would attempt to warn them of their really impending doom. This post-war luxury of cheap, endless energy was on its way out, and the price of gas, which had remained basically the same for decades despite rises in inflation, it was about to skyrocket. An energy crisis, as he'd been calling it for years, was right around the corner. It wasn't just that oil prices would rise, it's what this meant for companies like GM and Ford and Chrysler. Their perceptions of the immediate future and the cars that they planned to make, and in their mind, cars that were guaranteed to sell well because they had in the past, all of that was gone according to Maxwell. They would have to change their entire business models or bend the knee to foreign competition out of countries where making economic vehicles was already second nature at this point. At best, these higher-ups would hear Charlie out. Well, Chrysler heard him out, at least with somewhat of an open mind. Ford wouldn't even give him a moment with the actual executives, and GM didn't give him a meeting at all. Halberstam says this in his book: Detroit was Detroit, and more than most business centers, it was a city that listened to its own voice. Detroit, Maxwell feared, was going to have to learn its new truths the hard way. Boy, would that be the truth. Meanwhile, in the East, a war was brewing, both literally and figuratively. First, there was the Yom Kippur War, during which Arab OPEC nations imposed an oil embargo on countries supporting Israel, including the US. This embargo drastically cut oil exports, leading to severe shortages and a quadrupling of oil prices. OPEC's newfound power, combined with growing global oil demand and economic instability from the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, really just made the crisis worse. The result was widespread economic disruption, fuel rationing, and most importantly, a push for better energy efficiency, especially in cars. But the more figurative war was taking place much further east, in Japan. After World War II, Japan's infrastructure was in ruins, and there was a demand for cheap, reliable vehicles. The Japanese government encouraged domestic manufacturers to produce vehicles suited for the Japanese market. That is, small, fuel-efficient, and affordable cars. I'm guessing you can see where this is going. This led to the creation of the K car category in 1949, which limited engine size and vehicle dimensions, really sparking innovation among manufacturers like Suzuki and Honda and Daihatsu. The Japanese government played a key role in fostering competition by encouraging companies to modernize production methods and adopt Western innovations like assembly line manufacturing. Toyota, Nissan, and smaller automakers like Subaru really competed to produce vehicles that were both affordable for domestic buyers, but also competitive in export markets. The same sort of war between Japanese manufacturers to build the perfect motorcycle was taking place now in the four-wheeled world. The 1966 Japanese automobile manufacturing law would push companies like Honda to get involved, to move away from focusing almost exclusively on motorcycles to now four-wheeled vehicles. So Japanese automakers were poised to take over, and the 1973 oil crisis really became a major turning point. They were already experienced in building small, efficient cars, and as gas prices skyrocketed, they were in the perfect position to take over and gain really global dominance. Here's the thing though, there's so much more to the story of the Japanese takeover than just these manufacturers having an ability to make fuel-efficient cars. I mean, British cars were small and fuel-efficient. Why didn't the British industry take over in the 70s instead of slowly dying? Simply put, their cars were crap compared to what was coming out of Japan, and I say that as a full-blown British car enthusiast who owns and drives an MG Midget. Those cars were way behind the competition at the time. Japanese companies embraced Kaizen, a philosophy of constant, incremental improvement in manufacturing processes and product quality. And this approach, which was really championed by Toyota, was also adopted by Honda and Nissan and others, really giving them just better reliability and production efficiency. By the 1960s and 70s, Japanese automakers began exporting cars focusing on fuel efficiency, reliability, and affordability. The Toyota Corolla, for example, first introduced in '66, became a global bestseller, and it really showed off this strategy. Honda's real breakthrough in the automotive market came with the Civic in the 1970s, which became a sensation for its fuel economy and emissions compliance. Toyota focused on building high-quality, reliable cars, while Nissan took a more innovative approach with, sportier cars like the Datsun Nissan 240Z, which was really an incredible car and beloved really all over the world. The 240Z and the Z line stands out in the 70s as one of just a few truly fun cars, we could say. Though Honda was late to the car industry, it really leveraged its motorcycle expertise and engineering to challenge all of the established players, notably with the Civic and the Accord. If the 1970s marked an important time for Japanese automakers to really excel, why call it a bad decade? Now, it's not that important things didn't happen, and it's not that there weren't significant advancements in some areas, most notably reliability. It's just that for car enthusiasts, it was really a time of great suffering. The Civic or Volkswagen Rabbit, they were great cars, don't get me wrong, but they weren't awe-inspiring like the standout cars from the 60s. Even something like the Mini and Mini Cooper S from the 60s, with not only its reputation for being economical and practical, but also just its incredible success in racing. The Volkswagen Rabbit and Civic, they were never going to win the Monte Carlo rally. In general, the point is that cars got less fun, less powerful, and uglier. That's the main point. And just design in general was just not good compared to the previous decade. In terms of power, nobody was hit as hard as American manufacturers. As these efficient, affordable cars hit the Western markets, some of them being sports cars, Detroit found itself scrambling to catch up, but there was a problem in the way that these manufacturers approached the market. They'd become so complacent from their success over the past few decades, and the big three, they didn't really function as three super competitive brands constantly pushing to innovate and challenge one another. I mean, that's how they wanted to be viewed. In all reality, they almost functioned like one large company, all essentially making the same products, and at this point, having a sort of shared monopoly. Rarely wanting to be the one part of that monopoly to step out and risk things with an entirely new revolutionary product. So in simple terms, through the 70s, they just kind of made their existing cars worse. This decade marked a dramatic decline in automotive performance. Horsepower ratings absolutely plummeted as engines were detuned to meet emission standards, and weight was increased due to additional safety features. For example, the 1970 Corvette, a symbol of American performance, offered engines with up to 450 horsepower, but by 1975, its most powerful option was a 205 horsepower small block V8, kind of a shadow of its former self. It wasn't really until the late 80s that American V8s would begin to reach a similar status as their former glory. This performance decline was not limited to muscle cars. Luxury and mainstream models also suffered, becoming sluggish and uninspiring to drive. The joy of spirited driving, which was once a hallmark of the 60s, that was replaced with vehicles that prioritized compliance over excitement. But American automakers had some experience making small, more economical cars, right? Well, sort of. Prior to this point, American economy vehicles were essentially just cut down versions of those larger cars. A car like the Ford Pinto, for example, couldn't hold a candle to what the Japanese and European manufacturers were creating. What was needed at this point was a new kind of vehicle, purpose-built from the ground up with innovation at every level. Something like, for example, the Volkswagen Rabbit, a front-wheel drive car that had no need for a drive shaft, which eliminated weight, created more space for passengers while still staying small. The higher-ups at the big companies knew that they needed a vehicle like that, but they were all unwilling to be the first to invest significant capital, and so they just carried on, focusing mostly on those large, heavy cars, giving them massive but choked out, underpowered V8s. Just as it started to look positive, though, for the big three as the 70s were coming to a close, the Americans were getting used to higher gas prices. The 1979 Iranian Revolution would once again cause oil supply chains to be disrupted, once again driving up fuel prices. For American automakers, the demand for fuel-efficient cars was only going up. Japanese automakers again capitalized on this shift and dominated the market with reliable economic cars. Meanwhile, American cars struggled to adapt. The energy crisis was perhaps the single biggest factor in making American cars worse, but there was quite a lot more happening at this time. One of the most significant changes to cars in the 70s was the introduction of safety and emissions regulations, especially in the United States. Now, these were not all bad. We often demonize these things for making cars uglier, for example. Some of these things were good, but looking back, some of these things, weren't great. For example, the federal mandates that required cars to be equipped with 5-mile-per-hour impact-resistant bumpers. This was, mostly silly. Automakers everywhere scrambled to meet these requirements, often resorting to large, ungainly rubber or metal bumpers that were just basically bolted to existing designs. A car like the MGB, for example, went from this to this. These bumpers really disrupted the sleek lines of many cars, making them appear bulky and awkward. Also, emissions regulations really became a thing at this point. The Clean Air Act of 1970 forced manufacturers to implement catalytic converters and air pumps and other emissions control devices. These were environmentally beneficial. They often came at the cost of reduced engine power and efficiency. Iconic muscle cars like the Camaro and Mustang, once symbols of raw performance, they were neutered by lower compression ratios and restrictive exhaust systems, and they really did lose much of their appeal. But it is true that, we went from being, the kind of country where you went to a gas station and sat in line and you just breathed exhaust. So it's not all bad. It just would take quite a long time for many manufacturers to figure out how to deal with these restrictions. Even in a place like Great Britain, where cars were already developed under many of these constraints, we watched manufacturers like MG and Triumph slowly die as the 70s carried on. Now, the design language of the 70s really reflected these regulatory constraints. The need for standardized safety features like large bumpers and side impact reinforcements led to cars that appeared bloated and homogenized. Aerodynamics and aesthetic appeal took a backseat to regulatory compliance, resulting in vehicles that lacked the elegance and individuality of earlier decades. Also, there was such a focus on cost cutting at this point. Most cars had uninspired interiors, poor build quality, the rise of plastic as a primary material in both exterior and interior components just made cars feel cheaper. The craftsmanship present on many cars of the 60s, even affordable cars, was all but gone. I want to close this video out though by looking at a few of the absolute worst cars from the 70s to really highlight how bad things were. First, the Ford Pinto. Introduced in 1971, the Ford Pinto was Ford's answer to the growing popularity of small, affordable cars imported from places like Japan and Europe. Designed to be lightweight and inexpensive, the Pinto was developed in just 25 months in an unusually short time for this era. Ford prioritized cost and speed over safety, leading to its most infamous flaw, a dangerously placed rear-mounted fuel tank that could ignite in a rear-end collision. Now, the decision to forego a design fix, despite internal documents showing that Ford was aware of this issue, really cemented the Pinto's reputation. The controversy escalated when the Pinto memo revealed that Ford had calculated it was cheaper to pay legal settlements for potential deaths than to redesign the car. Public backlash and lawsuits followed, and the Pinto became a symbol of corporate greed. Now, despite this, it sold well initially, with over 3 million units produced, really highlighting the disconnect between public perception and consumer demand. Next, there's the AMC Gremlin. Launched in 1970, the AMC Gremlin was American Motor Corporation's attempt to compete in this burgeoning, developed under tight financial constraints. The Gremlin was essentially a truncated version of AMC's larger Hornet, with a rear end that looked like it had been abruptly chopped off. Now, its unique styling did get attention. It also made the Gremlin the butt of countless jokes. The car was inexpensive, it offered decent power with an optional 6-cylinder engine, but its build quality and refinement left much to be desired. Handling was subpar, and its cramped interior didn't help its appeal. Despite its flaws, the Gremlin was a modest sales success for AMC, as it filled a niche for an affordable small car with American roots. Over time, however, its quirky design and lackluster engineering would earn its place on lists of automotive missteps. And last, we have the Austin Allegro. Released in 1973 by British Leyland, the Austin Allegro was meant to be a cutting-edge replacement for the Austin 1100-1300. The Allegro suffered from poor planning and rushed execution. Its Cortic square steering wheel, which was just a misguided attempt at innovation, really became an emblem of its failure, as did its bulbous, awkward design. Mechanical reliability was another Achilles heel. The Allegro's suspension, which was innovative on paper, was plagued by leaks and failures. Production quality suffered from the chaotic conditions at British Leyland. British Leyland during the 70s, that's a whole nother story. Labor strikes and mismanagement was rampant. The car's tendency to rust quickly, its uninspiring driving dynamics, really made it uncompetitive against rivals from Volkswagen and Toyota, and despite selling over 640,000 units, the Allegro became a symbol of British Leyland's decline. Now, I find this transitional period that is the 70s fascinating for multiple reasons. Sure, it is looked back as one of the single worst decades, if not the worst decade in automotive development, and in many ways that is kind of an American sentiment. It's hard to get excited about cars that essentially became shells of their former glory, which is what happened to pretty much all the great American cars. What I find most interesting is just how applicable the challenges were at this time to what manufacturers today face. We're once again in a pretty bad lull in terms of design and inspiration, and I think that's because it's not exactly clear what the future holds for most manufacturers. For a while, it looked like electric was the future, with just about every major manufacturer, at least signaling that they were going to go electric. And of course, companies like Lotus completely abandoned their history and their entire niche to go entirely EV. Because, I guess it's a better business model to sell like 8 $3 million cars than it is to sell a bunch of cool cars. I don't know. Actual EV sales, though, are in decline in many key markets. Automotive design is perhaps at an all-time low. If there was a lack of inspiration in the 70s, there's virtually zero inspiration today. As is always the case, innovation is the path forward. For those manufacturers that struggled through the 70s, the way out was to create interesting and creative designs, and the 80s and 90s would really be the decades that those cars would happen. Cars like the C4 Corvette or the Dodge Viper or, even the F-150. That's what we need today. We need interesting, innovative cars. Not innovative in the sense that, they now have electric/hybrid drivetrains. That isn't innovative anymore. A car like the Miata is a truly innovative car. It's a car that I don't even understand how it can exist. We need more stuff like that because that's the path forward. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you in the next one. Drive safe.